Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back to the PrimateCast. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh, and the release date for today's podcast is Wednesday, February 18th, 2015. So I have to apologize for the late start in 2015, but as everyone can understand, I'm sure, the turn of the year is always a busy time with holidays and food and great things like that. So to start 2015, I'd like to introduce this podcast, which is going to go back with Cécile Sarabia and another installment of a student conference in conservation science. But before getting into that with Cécile, just to mention a couple of upcoming podcasts in the future, in the near future, I hope, we'll be hearing from Dr. Naobi Okayatsu, who's with the World Wildlife Fund in Japan. And we'll also hear from some conservationists and researchers in a special focus podcast on issues in biodiversity conservation in Sabah, Malaysian Borneo specifically. And we'll also be presenting a podcast with the coordinator of the project for the application of law for fauna. But before all of these, let's get back into today's podcast. So I welcome back, apparently, the SCCS correspondent, Cécile Sarabia.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you have quickly become our, as I mentioned, correspondent for SCCS conferences around the world. So tell us about Brisbane.
Yeah, SCCS Australia was held at the University of Queensland between the 19th and the 29th of January. And I went there, to warm up, but also to present a talk and of course to report for the PrimateCast. So it was very diverse in terms of students' nationality, for example. We had students from Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Madagascar, Malaysia, and Australia, of course.
I think in the first interview that you present, it's also mentioned that this kind of covers a different geographic region for conservation and reaches a different type of audience. Yeah,
so basically, I think the majority of the students and the plenary speakers were walking between the Himalayas and the Fiji, which is a biodiversity hotspot, one of the biggest.
Mm-hmm. And so can you tell us about the structure of this conference? I mean, how does it compare and contrast to other SCCS events?
So compared to Bangalore, it's much more intimate. I think we were about 100 participants in this one, and in Bangalore we were over 350, so more opportunities to interact and to go talk to the people, more time as well. But it was also a much longer conference because it was over a 2 weeks period. So we started with 3 days of presentations and then 3 days of excursions where we went to the Australia Zoo, for example, and the Lone Pine Koala Sanctuary near Brisbane. And then the next week it was a week of workshops, basically.
Yeah, so fewer participants, but a much more intensive interactive experience.
Yeah.
And a lot of learning opportunities. So you wanted to talk something about your workshop experience there.
Yeah, I attended one workshop particularly, I think amazed us all the attendees of this workshop. It was called Creative Conversations About Conservation, and it was organized by the collective Artifact, which is a collective of scientists and artists which aims to explore new ways of communicating conservation science. And we had a couple of hours to come up with a group project. So we were working per groups. And it was completely free, but we had to create a project facilitating this process of communicating conservation science. And one good example was a group of students who came up with the idea of creating a podcast.
Great idea.
But a podcast that would be released in India for local communities and communicating their research about wildlife and human conflicts. But a podcast made out of only sounds. So there was a sound artist at this workshop called Leah Barclay, and she thought that it was a great idea, and she offered to produce the podcast. So
wow! So turning that short little workshop into something actionable sounds pretty impressive.
Within 2 hours, so great. And at this workshop, there was also Payal Bal, one of the co-founder of Artifact, I think, and Ariel Marcy, who is a young scientist and game designer. And yeah, I came back to Japan with her game as an omiyage, as a present for the Primate Research Institute. So it was quite good. So it's called Go Extinct, and this game is about evolution and educating, learning about evolution. The board is a phylogenetic tree where you have to gather the different families of species.
So kind of in the way that these kind of conferences want to spring young people into action, this kind of game maybe, instead of just raising awareness about issues, actually has young kids getting involved and doing things and learning kind of hands-on what's going on. So that's pretty cool. And I just wanted to mention that game, on the cover of the box, it mentions it was funded by Kickstarter. So I think these kind of developing, call them institutions or programs like Kickstarter, which allow young people and people who want to take action the opportunity to get some funding to do those things. It's really great to see the diversity of application of the source of funding.
Yeah. So I told Ariel I'm gonna bring back your game to Japan instead of bringing cookies or stuff that you always brought. I will bring back your game. And then I started like very enthusiastic and say, oh, that's a really good idea. I want to translate your game into Farsi, into Persian.
Yeah.
And then I saw the game, I opened the box, and I saw this massive phylogenetic tree on the board. I said, oh, maybe, no, sorry.
Too much, too soon?
Yeah, it wouldn't be possible.
Okay, just for future reference, the game was great souvenir, but how about a game and cookies next time? Okay, so moving on to what you presented there. You were there also, in addition to representing the PrimateCast, you were representing Roots and Shoots Iran. Yeah,
so at SCCS Bangalore already I presented a poster about our project, but this time I give a talk. I had the opportunity to give a talk about Roots and Shoots Iran and our nature school based in Mashhad, which is the second biggest city in Iran. Our school is called Kavikonch Nature School, which had its official opening no later than last December, with government officials. So it was a quite good start, and since then we have been receiving children every day. And next week we are going to have an exhibition in Tehran for 5 days, where we hope to receive the visit of the head of the environmental organization, who is Masume Ebtekar. She was one of the awardees for the Champion of the Earth in 2006, so she's a quite big figure in Iran, and we hope that she will somehow get interested in the project. So our goal again is still to facilitate this relation between children and nature, something that is becoming harder and harder in Iran, as 75% of the population is living in cities.
And so how was that received at the conference? Did you get any useful feedback and further interactions with other people?
Yeah, it was well received. Still, not that much people knew about what is Roots and Shoots. But about the concept, I often heard during presentations the importance of this relation between children and nature. And in fact, I had students also coming to me at the end of the presentation who wanted to start similar activities in their home country. And for example, this student from Brazil who, after this conference, went in touch with Roots and Shoots groups in Brazil. And then she told me not so long ago that she will join them after her trip to Australia. So,
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can actually see the outcomes of these kind of getting these students together and how different people can get involved later and learn through networking and what kind of things are out there for them to do. That's
exactly.
Pretty cool. Yeah. Okay, so one of the first things you said to me when you came back after this conference was how immediately you wanted to start implementing some of the ideas and things you learned at these student conferences into your own work. So how important is it for you, or now collectively you've had 2 student conferences in conservation science and one more coming soon in Cambridge, which we'll talk about in a second, but how important or what kind of impact is that having on kind of the way you see things and your outlook for your own place here?
Well, I'm currently in kind of, or I have a more pure research background, but I've always been interested in conservation. So for me, it's great to attend search conferences and interact with search network. But my going into these conferences and then going back to a research institute, and I aim to implement more conservation science, or to raise the level of conservation awareness into the scientific community, and I think it's important because scientists are on the front line of such issues. They are aware of those issues. They are working in areas where we have environmental and wildlife issues. So, but something we brought up with Kay, for example, one of the interviewee of this podcast, studying the impact of microplastic on marine wildlife, is that it should begin with ourselves. And we were even surprised that, for example, at this conference, at a student conference on conservation science, people were not necessarily behaving sustainably. For example, we saw food waste. We saw that the beans, like during coffee breaks, there were no recycling. So this kind of examples. So I think, even conservationists have still lots of work ahead, and maybe starting with themselves. Yeah.
Okay. Before we get into SCCS Cambridge, just can you give us a quick synopsis of what kinds of interviews we'll be hearing, what kind of topics will be discussed in the next hour?
Yeah, so it will range from the use of the customary use of vulturine parrots in the island of Papua New Guinea, coming to the impact of microplastic on our oceans and marine wildlife, to investigating the Chinese ivory trade. And most of the talks that you will hear won a prize at this conference.
Yeah, I thought maybe you had some in with the judges, but apparently all of the people you selected to interview ended up winning prizes.
But I didn't know that, because we conducted the interviews before we knew they won the prize. But 4 out of the 9 interviewers in this podcast, won a prize. So.
And many of the others were either plenaries or keynote speakers, so obviously not in the competition. And we should probably just give a brief mention that in some cases here, due to technical difficulties with the audio, by ungoverned environmental conditions, I guess you can say, we had to omit some parts of certain interviews and even remove one interview entirely. So can you just...
I apologize for this, but because the conference was held, the presentations were just for 3 days, so I had the booth just for 3 days at the venue, but otherwise the rest of the interviews have to be conducted outside, basically. And on an evening, I sat down with Professor Lei Chao from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, who gave a talk on migratory birds along the Yangtze River. It was a very, very inspiring talk, as she was also one of the plenary speakers of this conference. But unfortunately, because of too windy evening, we had to remove this interview. So I hope that in the future, somehow, someday, somewhere, I will catch up with Lei and be able to conduct an interview with her. Yeah.
Right. Lastly about this, so as in Bangalore, we had a lot of help setting up the PrimateCast. So we'd like to again thank them there, and for this time as well, I'd like to thank the organizers and everybody in Brisbane who helped out the PrimateCast get set up there. So thanks very much. Okay, so last order of business, SCCS Cambridge. Can you give details for that upcoming podcast and event?
Yeah, so it will be held at the University of Cambridge between March 24th to March 26th. So be sure that I will be there, and and I will be also presenting a poster about roots and shoots Iran. So
great. So best of luck with that, and you'll be back in early April to start your PhD work here at the Primate Research Institute.
Yes, finally.
Okay, and we'll be presenting that podcast sometime in April. So without further ado, I guess we should move on to SCCS Australia and hear the show that you have put together here for everyone.
Okay, let's go back to the Seine, let's go back to Brisbane and see what was this conference about.
My name is Hugh Possingham. I'm a professor of ecology and mathematics at the University of Queensland, and I direct two national research centres. One looks at environmental decision making at a global scale, and the other one, which has recently started, is a national centre for research in threatened species recovery.
All right. So Hugh, can you tell us a bit more about what is SCCS Australia and when it started?
So maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I was one of the keynote speakers at the SCCS in Cambridge, which has been going now for more than a decade. I thought it was a great event. It was just a 3-day conference there, and I met lots of students. They enjoyed it a lot. They had lots of interactions with each other, but also people that weren't students as well. I thought, well, we should try and do this in Australia. Very hard for Australians to get all the way to Europe, and most of the people there were Europeans. They'd funded quite a few people from Africa and a little bit from Asia, but not many people from our part of the world. So I thought, well, why don't we do this in Australia? It took me a long time to do it, but 2013 we had our first conference. That was 2 years ago. We'll probably only do it every 2 years. The one thing we did was a little bit different. Instead of just having the 3-day conference, we are fully funded using money from the Thomas Foundation, who's a philanthropist who I advise, and the Thomas Foundation have given us $50,000, and we can fully fund around about 30 students from poorer countries in the region, like Cambodia, Fiji, Solomons. And so we fully fund them airfares, accommodation, everything. They pay nothing, because Australia's very expensive. And so we thought, well, just to bring people here for 3 or 4 days and listen to some talks wasn't enough. So we've added some field trips, but we've also added 4 days of workshops and training, which is next week, where they can learn basic things about writing grant proposals, giving talks, dealing with the media, technical things like learning R, GIS, spatial planning, decision science. So a lot of that, again, all that's done for free. So we keep it very short. Almost everything we're doing here is basically staff and postdocs and students in our centres that are running the whole conference for free, and we can keep the cost down. And then now it goes for 10 days, which also gives the students a lot more chance to interact with each other. So part of it is obviously the science side, but I think the most important part of these conferences is the fact that people are forming their peer group, and most people's peer group forms inside their own university or their country, but this is a chance to form a network of friends that's international. And I suppose, finally, I mean, the United Kingdom's a lovely place, Cambridge is lovely, but the United Kingdom has no biodiversity values almost at all. There's almost no endemic species. Yet between the Himalayas and Fiji, there's probably 30% of all the species on the planet in a very small area. So marine and terrestrial. So to me, this is the most important region in the world in terms of biodiversity. It seems to have less conservation science than particularly North America through to Central America, and then Europe through to Africa. There's a lot more conservation scientists, so we're really missing out, and this wasn't a chance to try and build a bigger group of people interested in conservation in the region.
And I think it worked pretty well for most of the students who attended the conference. Now, in the second part of this interview, we are going back to Hugh Possingham's talk, where he discussed the trade-off that conservationists often have to face between monitoring and management, or in other terms, between learning and taking action.
Yeah, I think a lot of ecologists are trained to monitor things, and they always want more data, they want more information. And I think if you're in pure ecology, obviously that's the game, isn't it? We're trying to progress knowledge, information is essential. But when we start moving into applied conservation, we do have to decide every time we spend $1 spent on monitoring and science and evaluation of things, we're actually not spending $1 on managing something. So if we're looking after threatened species or ecosystems or ecosystem services, we've really got to decide that trade-off. And the tendency from scientists is always to tell the management agencies to monitor more. And in some cases I think they get sick of it because they start wondering, well, why am I spending all this money gathering information, analysing information, reporting on the information? And often there's no feedback between that information and the management. Now, the objective of an applied manager, a conservation biologist, is actually to try and save a species or save an ecosystem or stop something, a threat. And if that's the objective, then you have to evaluate monitoring in the context of that objective. And if the monitoring is just being turned into publications nothing else, and isn't changing management, then the monitoring has no role in an applied discipline. It's a bit like the difference between engineering and physics. The physicists, of course, they're studying the world, but engineers, they're building bridges and they're building roads, and I consider conservation scientists are engineers. They're solving the problem. Engineers do monitor things, but they monitor what they need to monitor to make sure the bridge doesn't fall down or that their spending's on track. So they monitor what they need to solve the problem, which is to build the bridge so it doesn't fall down and it's cheap and it gets people from A to B. So it's purpose-driven monitoring. And I think so many conservation biologists have come from ecology, from a pure background as an undergraduate, they actually haven't been trained to make their monitoring applied, and often they will be advising people to monitor too much. So I think one of the solutions to this is, in management issues, we should maybe monitor fewer things, but we should monitor those few things much better. So often we're funding lots of management interventions for lots of species at a big scale, and we make everybody monitor everything, but a lot of the monitoring is of a poor quality, never gets analysed, never gets published. But probably what we really need to do is pick the winners, pick the really contentious, interesting questions, monitor those things well. So I'm not saying stop monitoring, I'm just saying make sure you know why you're monitoring, and if you can't answer the question, now I've counted this thing or measured this thing, tell me how how that knowledge will change what I do on the ground. If you can't answer that question, then you're not monitoring for purpose.
There is an unanswered question, which is how much data do we need
That's
to...
right.
Yeah.
And we've written now maybe 20 papers on some of these issues, like how much data do you need? So one of our best papers in Ecology Letters by Hedley Grantham showed that in South Africa, if we look back at the way they've expanded their reserve system, and if they were building a reserve system using standard reserve design principles, trying to conserve, let's say, all the plants, how much plant data would you need? And we found out that to make very good decisions, they needed 10% of the plant data they had. So they already had 10 times as much plant data. And if at any point in time somebody had said, let's stop expanding the reserve system and wait for a while until we get more plant data, they would have definitely been wrong. Because not only do you potentially waste money, but potentially also you delay action. And in conservation, sometimes it's better to act now and conserve areas before they're destroyed. So telling people you can't do something because you haven't got enough information is often one of the worst things scientists can do, and conservation biologists. And often, in fact, governments stop action by doing that. They say, we don't know enough, so let's not do any more conservation actions until we have more information. And then, as we say, the world falls to pieces while we take no action. And scientists often buy into that by taking grants to gather more information. What they should be doing is saying, no, you need to keep acting. And then they should be working out, would that information have any value in terms of future decisions? Which leads us through to some of our more recent work on value of information analysis. So you actually work out explicitly what is the value of that information, how much money of my budget should I spend on it, and is that information more valuable than just doing more things? And it's possible to do it. It's not easy, so we're working on trying to make it easier for people to actually do this trade-off between monitoring and management.
All right. I hope it's the way it's going. Let's end this short discussion with Decision Point. So what is Decision Point about?
Yes, so Decision Point is a monthly magazine that comes out from the two centres that I direct. And about 8 years ago, we realised that managers and politicians and bureaucrats and people in non-government organisations like WWF, they have very little time to read the scientific literature, and often they can't access the scientific literature. So we employed somebody who's very good at writing called David Salt, and David Salt is a science writer, has a science degree, and we work with him to take each of our publications, either singly or in groups, and turn them into 1 or 2 page more popular stories. Not as silly and glib as a press release, but more substantive. But the maths would be taken out, a lot of the figures would be taken out, and a 6,000 word publication in conservation biology would turn into about a 700 word story with pictures, and really focusing on what it means for the policymaker and the manager. So Decision Point's been running for almost 10 years, we have 5,000 subscribers from around the world. Most of them are still in Australia, but we're trying to expand the international base, and we're also trying to see if other people in other universities who are doing more applied conservation want to turn their articles into these stories, and we get very good response. So several thousand people in Australia regularly read Decision Point, and their managers, their people are making decisions, and they find that format of information much better than papers. If they really want to go to the paper, then they can then email us and we send them the paper. So it means that they can get a handle on the literature much quicker and in a much more pleasant fashion than trawling through Web of Science or Google Scholar.
Yeah, great. And I think you can subscribe for free, right?
That's right, yeah.
So you can go online at www.decision-point.com.au.
That's right, or you can Google Decision Point Possingham, and
Alright.
that'll get you there as well. So it's easy to get to, and we hope to make it more international in the next few years.
International. That's exactly what this conference was about. So let's start the journey.
My name is Grace Noogie, and I represent the Wildlife Conservation Society. And my presentation was based on the customary use of vulturine parrots in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. And that was to attain for my honours degree in the University of Papua New Guinea. Basically, the research was done on a basis of finding out, relating the population decline, the declining trend of the vulturine parrots, to how the Highlanders use the feathers in their hairdresses. And what we found was basically quite a huge number of birds are killed every year, and that's about 1,000 birds per year. And that's only within that small study site, which is the Karawagi district. And apart from that, in the province alone, there's 6 other districts, which I think if I had carried out more questionnaires around that, we would find there's a lot more birds are killed than we imagined. About 3 parrots are required to do one single head ornament, and then one person owns 3 of those head ornaments, so on average about 13 birds per person. And then they're being replaced, the replacement frequency is about 20 years. So I think the fact that the people are quite preserving it quite well, that's the reason behind it, being surviving. So because what WCS is doing is we're trying to, after this research, we are basically taking 3 main steps. And first of all is to promote or enhance and encourage the people to preserve it better. If we can preserve the years for the feathers for another 5 years, then that can reduce the number of birds being hunted by about 20%. And second to that, I'd like to do more species distribution modeling, which I am still learning how to do that. And then we can target the specific areas where the birds are in decline and where it's practical to save them. Last to that is to promote or inform the policy decision makers to at least, because where the demand for the birds stems from an area where the birds are, it's not within that distribution range. It's further up, higher altitudes. Basically, the birds are found within 200 to 1,800 meters above sea level, and the area of the cultural use of it is 2,000 meters above sea level, which is hundreds of miles away from where it's found. So we basically want to ban or at least put a stop to the transferring of live birds, at least the feathers, from the the lower elevations towards the highlands region. So we're working on that. And for the hunters, generally, because the birds are quite picky about where they lay their eggs, they want hollow nests and hollow trees, and then they don't use the same nest twice. So they have to find another place to lay their eggs. So if the hunters cannot disturb or cut down the dead hollow trees, then maybe we could generate more or preserve the nests where they're hunted. and to stick to traditional means of hunting, which is the bow and arrow. The guns generally, we believe they scare the birds away, and that can interrupt with their range. So in summary, that's my study, and hopefully the next stage is to go into more species distribution modeling and study more about the ecology of the bird.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So that's at the border between ethnology, ethnology studies, and conservation, and that's very fascinating. And I had a question during your talk. I was thinking, so do they use only the feathers of those birds, or do they value somehow the meat of the bird?
Yeah, the birds are actually from the people who are within that area. They don't hunt them for the meat.
So it's only
the feathers, and they're not using the feathers. It's the people from the outside who are demanding it. What I've found out was they're quite hard to catch because they're in the higher canopies. So what they usually do is they target the nesting sites, and then I think when they do get the birds, then they probably eat the meat as well, but it's a higher concentration towards the feathers. And there's only they're predominantly black, and they have 6 or so red feathers on them, and their contour body is also red. So they need 3 birds, So it's I really need to we need to do something about these birds being killed. Yeah, and the IUCN Red List categorizing it as vulnerable was done back in 1990s. Towards that time, so up until today, that may have moved up to being threatened. So it would be good to revisit the category.
And I do have another question. I did a bit of investigation about you, actually. I found out that you are Miss Papua New Guinea, if I'm right.
Yes.
So I want to know if this image somehow helps you to, because you are also associated to WCS.
Yes.
So if it helps you to promote more public awareness into conservation, and how do you use this image as well?
I was lucky enough to have WCS release me or let me skip off work a bit to enter the pageant. It's more, the pageant is not necessarily a beauty pageant. It's about being a cultural ambassador for our country to the Pacific. And so with my study, it's kind of linked together. I've interviewed people and gained some traditional ecological knowledge. And with WCS, the work we do is more with Papua New Guinea. We have this issue of landowner rights, and so we can come up with all these policies, information to give to policymakers to implement. But then it all comes down back to the people. If they say yes, we want to preserve this, or yes, I can declare this as a taboo, no hunting zone. But so you have to make the people happy. And one of the ways I think being this public figure in Papua New Guinea is I've been the platform I used was one of them was conservation and preservation because of our biodiversity. I mean, we have 7% of the world's global species, and it's dying out at a fast rate just because the government and the people themselves are not informed. They have these companies going in, giving them huge amount of cash and money. So it all comes down to educating people. And if you're just a nobody, they don't know you and they're not comfortable with you, and then you go in and present them okay, this is this, and don't do this, then they're okay. But this having the platform of Miss PNG and a public figure in Papua New Guinea has I'm just 3 months into my reign. So hopefully throughout the whole year, then I can use this platform and inform the people through the media, social media, the newspaper, and TV as well. So I have a big task ahead of me.
And congratulations to Grace, who got the Special Mention Prize for her talk at the conference. Hope to see you in Papua New Guinea. So now, let's give the microphone to another keynote speaker of this conference.
I'm Eric Meijert. I came here to Brisbane, to the University of Queensland, to talk to the many students that came up here for the excellent conservation course. And what I really wanted to talk about is my experience as both a conservation scientist and a conservation practitioner, because I think a lot of people at their start of their career, they're developing as conservation scientists, and they develop as conservation scientists because they care about conservation. But they're actually quite different paths, and it's a trick to find the right way to combine what you're doing in conservation science and develop through that something that actually has positive impact on conservation practice. So I took my time. I gave a plenary speech, talked about how I developed as a conservation scientist, how I started working initially in Indonesia, worked for as a scientist, for a number of NGOs, and more recently as a research coordinator, where we're really trying to develop the kind of science that can be implemented in policy that touches the heart of people and allows us to change things. So this is what I was talking about, in the hope that that people would pick up some useful messages, some take-home messages that would allow them to, or at least think a little bit more about how they went about developing, or they were going to go about developing their own careers. And judging the feedback from the students, it's been really positive. Many people say it's been really excellent. The stuff I was talking about, really good thinking for them. So I'm very pleased I came out here, and it's been great to have been invited by the University of Queensland for this opportunity.
Yeah, great. So just to go back a bit into your talk, you mentioned quite early that pigs are far more important than orangutans. So can you develop this?
I don't think anyone is in a position to judge what is more important than whether one species is more important than another species. But what I do know is that if you talk to people in places like Kalimantan, Indonesian, Borneo, they get bored very quickly. You talk about orangutans. If you talk about pigs, they love it. They are really interested because pigs are important in their culture. Pigs provide important contribution to their diet. They like hunting pigs. There's a lot of excitement about it. So my argument has always been, I mean, pigs are threatened by the same factors as orangutans, overhunting and habitat loss, pretty much. If people are not interested in orangutans, well, work on pigs. You probably achieve co-benefits for orangutans at the same time. But so far, no one is listening. So I'll keep spreading the pig message and see if someone pays attention.
All right. And yeah, something else. You also mentioned that we can get also useful information from the best literature, for example. And you found out in a book from Alfred Wallace that by the time, he could see several orangutans in a day, and nowadays we consider orangutan as a solitary species. So he was kind of questioning this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just asking students, because everyone is pushed to be in front of, be at the top of their science and develop new methods. And but there's a whole lot of stuff written there in these old books that is just super interesting, that provides you insights into how nature functioned, how species functioned, in a way that we can't see anymore, because so much has changed even over time periods of like 150 years. And indeed, I mentioned the example of Wallace, who was collecting specimens whilst thinking about evolution, how we would shoot 11 orangutans in a day, and those are such large numbers. I mean, very, very, very few people will ever see that. And if you go consistently through the old literature and you look at species encounter rates like that, you realize that species were far more common in those days. And that makes you think again, what does that mean? I mean, if something occurs at like a density that's 5 or 10 times higher than now, it changes the socioecology of the species, the behavior. So what we're seeing now, if we look and go into the forest as a scientist, maybe a very narrow window of what we are observing, and doesn't really tell us that much necessarily about what the species truly is in its natural state.
Yeah, right. Last but not least, you also pointed out that there are field of studies that are understudied in conservation, and you pointed out the importance of maybe in the future implement more such kind of studies. I think those included psychology, sociology.
Yeah, I think conservation science comes from conservation biology, and it's generally the kids that care most about animals that want to go into something biological, and they see that the species they care about are disappearing, so you want to do something about conservation. That's all great. What I'm saying is conservation is really about managing society, about managing values that people have. And we need we need to learn a lot from people or scientists that deal with those values that we don't know, that as conservation biologists don't really understand. I wouldn't say not understand, but not from a scientific point of view, including indeed psychology and legal studies and religious studies. And there's a whole bunch of interesting sciences out there that could really help us understand conservation a lot better. And I would push anyone to step outside their own boundaries, their comfort zone, and look at these other studies and look at these other sciences and see what we can learn to become better and more effective conservationists.
More effective in a limited amount of time to save the biodiversity, to save the environment. Our two next speakers are good examples of promising conservationists. Those two young women both won the second prize for the best talk of the conference. So let's hear more about their research.
I'm Angela Recalde Salas. I'm a PhD student at the Centre for Marine Science and Technology at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia. I'm Colombian, and my research project is about baleen whale acoustics. So, and how to use the acoustics in conservation and optimal monitoring and management. Basically, what I'm doing is trying to estimate how frequently the animals vocalize and how this vocalization might change if we got vessels passing through, if we got more wind, more individuals, and how this might affect the probability of detection, the individuals, when we use only acoustics and we are not actually looking at the area the animals are passing by. Industry usually spends a lot of time using acoustics because it's cheaper and you can monitor bigger areas, but they are always asking of the likelihood of detecting individuals, and that's what my research is trying to approach, this likelihood of detection, and giving industry information on how long monitoring should be, how big an area for monitoring should be, and in that way the impacts of underwater noise could be controlled and could be mitigated in a better way. So what I'm using is I'm combining two different methodologies. I'm combining acoustical data with land-based data. So for the acoustics, I'm basically tracking everything that is vocalizing, every whale that is vocalizing underwater. I'm working with 3 species, humpback whales, blue whales, and right whales in areas with different anthropogenic use. So areas with shipping noise, areas with recreational vessels, and areas with not much going around, so I can compare the detection and the vocalization rates. And at the same time, when I'm recording, I'm looking, using a theodolite connected to a computer, I'm looking above water to see what is happening there. And then I combine both data sets, and I could say, okay, this individual was vocalizing at this time, this group was a mother with a calf, and they were approaching a vessel, or they were traveling, or what they were doing. And then I could say, and they were 6 individuals in the area, but only 3 were vocalizing. So that's kind of the research I'm doing. And hopefully with that, I will be able to tell industry, well, if you have these conditions, the minimum time that you need to spend to monitor a population, at least 50% of the population or 70% of the population, just using acoustics, needs to be 2 months, 3 months, and under these conditions. And also, another part of my research is sound transmission changes with the conditions in the area. So sometimes you can have monitoring acoustically 10 kilometers, for example, but other times only 5 kilometers because you have a vessel passing through. That is another question within my research that I will include to give industry which area they should monitor. If it's an area with a lot of traffic, they might need to increase the area of monitoring. But if it's an area where there is not much going on, they might monitor in a smaller area, and that will be a little bit cheaper because you need less time and less area to monitor. So yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Cool. It's now the 3rd day of the conference. What do you think of CCS Australia so far?
It's been great. I mean, I've been catching up with people and seeing that they're doing so many interesting things and working with plants and genetics. And I've seen many people using acoustics as well, which is very exciting because it's not a field that you use too much in conservation. Everyone talks about noise and everyone talks about acoustics, but it's not really a priority in conservation, even if everyone talks about that. So it's been interesting, and here in the plenaries is just so much encouragement that they give
inspiring,
you to,
yeah.
Exactly, it's inspiring, and it gives you an opportunity to network with people with lots of experience in conservation, and that's really nice. And it's really good also catch up with other students and see what everyone is doing, and get ideas, get feedback on your research, and share your research, and that's really good. And it's more relaxed than going to these big conferences where you're so scared of making mistakes. But here is kind of more a friendly environment, so I think it's good when you at the start, you don't have much results to share and stuff, so it's good.
Hello, my name is Kay Critchell. I'm a PhD student at James Cook University, Townsville. I am looking at the way microplastics affect the ocean, specifically looking at modeling the movement and accumulation of microplastics, also looking at the way they affect the physiology of small fish, and eventually developing a risk assessment procedure for microplastics.
All right, so you gave a talk here at SCCS Australia.
Yes.
And so that's the beginning of your PhD, but do you have already some outcomes, some preliminary results that you would like to share?
So I've just recently started the modeling of the microplastics. And it takes a really long time to develop a model accurately, but I'm getting some good results from my previous work with the larger plastic items, the ones that are buoyant and driven by the wind. And it's quite common knowledge when you go to the beach that things that float wash up on beaches that face the wind, but it's never been described in science before. So I've recently put a paper in for review about that, saying that it's a really big, that's where the plastics are going to accumulate, but modeling's always a developing process. And yeah, so that's really exciting, and that's some of the stuff I presented here at the conference.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. And so how did you come into studying the impact of plastic on wildlife?
Yeah, completely by accident. In my second and third year, I started working with my professor, Mark Hammond. He's a turtle biologist, physiologist, but he has a real passion for plastic debris. I started working with him doing an internship, and in my third year of uni I did a special topic looking at the amount of plastic that will be washed out of our local river in the wet season.
And it turned out that over 30,000 items would be washed from the river in the wet season. Then Kay made her official switch to the study of plastics for her honours research. She was supposed to study baby turtles, but instead, one day she came to her supervisor and told him that she wanted to study plastics because it was much more important to her and to the world. In the second part of this interview, I was asking Kay to describe what I called continents of plastics that are floating in different oceans. If you want to have a better look at it, you can Google it. Or if you want to know what are their impacts, you may watch the documentary Midway by Chris Jordan.
We call them just accumulations. We don't really have a specific term for them, but a lot of people refer to them as the Gaia garbage patches, but they're more like a soup. The plastic is accumulating in those areas due to the currents and the winds, but it's at such different densities that it floats all through the water column, makes it really available for all sorts of living things, which is a shame. In the big oceans in the world, the currents move in such a way that there's a northern and a southern Gaia, which is where the water's circling around, and in each one of those there's an accumulation of plastics.
So you said there are 6?
There are 5. Five big ones.
And their size is about the size of country?
It changes, but the really big one in the northern Pacific, they say is about the size of Texas. So it's pretty big. Yeah.
At the end of your talk, you kind of recommended encouraging the people to take some individual actions. So, for example, every time you go to a shop, instead of taking plastic bags, and still people do that a lot, you can just take your backpack or this, we always say like conference bags.
Made of
canvas
or a fabric. Yeah, they're really good. Bamboo fiber is really fabulous product. I think everyone should be wearing and using bamboo fabric. It's really sustainable and it's good for the environment. But I think everyone has a responsibility to reduce the amount of disposable plastic that we use in our everyday life, because it doesn't go away. So it's really important to take those individual steps.
Yeah, it takes about, I think, 100 years for plastic to decompose. So it's quite a lot.
In the documentary called Bag It, if you ever get a chance to watch that, it's a very good documentary about plastic bag use and generally disposable plastic use. But we don't recycle plastic bags in the Western world. We send it over to developing countries to do it there because it's such a horrible process.
It's too late to be a pessimist anyway. So let's end this interview with some hope and positive actions.
There is light at the end of the tunnel, definitely. If people take the responsibility to reduce the use, and we can reduce what's entering the ocean. Obviously, there's not much we can do about what's already there. I mean, beach cleanups are brilliant, and we can remove that and responsibly get rid of that. But I think if we can reduce what's entering the ocean, that's the most important thing we can do for marine debris.
And that's completely doable. Let's go back to Earth with our next speaker talking about grassland conservation in India.
My name is Trishant Simlai. I come from I work in Bangalore, from India. Currently I work as a consultant with an organization called the Foundation for Ecological Security, which is based in Gujarat in India. The kind of work that I'm doing is on protected area planning in India. So we are trying to set up an online protected area observatory, which looks at how protected area management is being done in these places. I had a presentation, I had a talk. So my research interests are very wide. Initially I started working with tigers, as almost every Indian in conservation does. But I sort of proceeded into human-wildlife conflict. After which, after I got my bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Kent in England, I sort of specialized in spatial conservation planning and systematic conservation planning. So my talk looked at how grasslands in India are converted very rapidly and termed as wastelands. And the talk I gave was part of my MSc dissertation work, which looked at how to prioritize conservation for grasslands. But what happens with many prioritization processes is that they only look at ecology, the ecological processes that for prioritization. So only looks at species distribution models and where grasslands are, which is problematic, because if you don't look at the social and political constraints of conservation planning, these kind of plans don't work. It's never result in action on the ground. So I incorporated some social and political constraints in conservation planning as part of my modeling process, and identified areas that needs conservation attention. That does not mean that it needs to be declared protected areas in all those areas, but need to be managed for better grassland conservation. So that's what my talk was about. Currently, my research has got nothing to do with spatial conservation planning. I've proceeded into social sciences. I am, in fact, just drafting a PhD proposal on political ecology. So my research basically will look at how conservation is becoming more and more militarized in nature. So how military practices are getting more and more imbibed into conservation. So things like shoot to kill policies and the use of military technology like radars and drones, and how that is problematic to local people who live in those areas, and how those policies can in fact be misused by conservation authorities for other kinds of crime. So that's the kind of research that I'm currently looking at.
Okay, very interesting. So Trishant, what do you think of the conference so far?
I think it's been great. There is a lot of international participation, way more than the last conference I attended. It's been very good to network with all these people, especially from the East Asian region. I'd never met people from Fiji and Solomon Islands before, so that was great to meet them and see the kind of conservation that is actually happening in this region. So I think SCCS Australia does great to attract people from this region, which the other SCCSs normally don't, because the geographical space is not that much.
So you was at SCCS Bangalore
Yes,
last September, right?
I've done SCCS Cambridge twice and SCCS Bangalore all 4 times.
Okay.
So I've got a fairly good idea about how SCCSs work. Cambridge is the main one. I think it probably is the most international one, but it's been running for a really long time. I think SCCS Bangalore has a lot of people which come in the conference, but it's dominated by Indians. There is less international participation in the SCCS Bangalore, though it is increasing every year. SCCS Australia has done, I think, really well to advertise really well for international students to come and present, and it's been great networking with all of them. I think one of the best things I liked about SCCS Australia till now, initially I thought that would be bad because most of the other SCCS give you 15 minutes to give your presentation and they give only 7, but that has sort of made them include more student talks. SCCS Australia is much more intimate than SCCS Bangalore or Cambridge. One reason that it's over 9 to 10 days, SCCS Australia, and it actually gives you time to sit with people you have common interests in, or just meet people who are doing some really cool conservation work from all over the world and absorb as much as you can. In the other conferences you get very little time to do that, so I think SCCS Australia stands out for that.
It's spreading so fast. If we do not stop poaching now, it should be even less than 10 years. We won't be able to see these elephants alive. They will all be gone.
20 years ago, I used to work right here in this park, and we were talking about the same things. And here we are 20 years later, and the problem is worse. The price of ivory has never been as high as it is today. It's worth more than gold. And that alone needs to send some alarm bells off.
My husband always used to say that humans are in fact the endangered species because we've stepped out of nature. We're actually jeopardizing our own survival. So, you reap what you sow, and it's as simple as that, really.
Wildlife officials say it is the biggest mass shooting of animals on record in Kenya. A gang of poachers slaughtering a family of 11 elephants and hacking off their tusks.
At the port of Mombasa, another seizure. Since the beginning of the year, at least 7 tons of ivory have been seized at the port of Mombasa alone.
It's a battle that we're fighting. In my opinion, it equates to the drug trade. It's big money. You have to be on your toes. Flying around these guys, they shoot at you. That's the first thing they do.
90% of the orphans that we have at the moment are due to poaching, where the mothers have been killed because of ivory. So it has to be considered a very big problem. When they lose their families, they will mourn about it. They will still grieve. He doesn't know what has happened to his mother.
If you were that baby elephant, how would you feel? That's exactly how they feel. The solution is, of course, to ban the sale of all ivory. It should be totally outlawed. Anyone who buys ivory nowadays has blood on their hands. They've killed not only the elephant that wore the tusks, but all its dependent young as well.
We're gonna find those who kill him. We'll find them. Come on. Come on, baby. Come to me. Elephants, they can read your heart. You might decide to forgive if someone has done something wrong to you. They also do that. They are like other human beings living in the wild. We need to respect them. They deserve protection. They deserve a right to life.
Take action. Stop the ivory trade is the message you can read at the end of this campaign of the David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust for iworry.org. And this is also what our next speaker is doing by investigating the Chinese ivory trade.
Hello everyone, my name is Yufang Gao. Most people just call me Gao. I'm a graduate student at Yale University and I come from China.
At SCCS Australia, Gao gave a talk titled Elephant Ivory Trade in China, Trends, Drivers and Possible Solutions. In this talk, he analyzed the three ivory markets in the Chinese society.
So the white market refers to the legal market. And in China, there are legal licensed ivory factories and ivory retail outlets. So in the whole China, there are about 36 ivory factories and 145 ivory retail outlets. So ivory sold in these markets are legal. This is the first type of market, the white market. And the second type of market is the black market, which is the illegal market. An illegal market takes two forms, including the online trading forum and also the offline illegal shops. This is the black market. And the third type of market is the grey market, which refers to the live auction of ivory products. And this market the legality of this market is uncertain because the current ivory policy in China doesn't differentiate the antique and new ivory. So some people perceived the auction is a legitimate trade channel for this antique ivory, but sometimes the new ivory can be labeled as an antique and put on auction. So this is the street market that I described in my research.
To conduct his research, Gao leads mainly undercover investigations. He also analyzed large volume of ivory trading data in China's markets.
So basically what I found is the white market or the legal market has increased from, I think it's about, I don't remember the exact number, but it's about 9 factories in 2004 to 37 factories in 2014, and about 20 or so ivory retail outlets in 2004 to 145. So the white market has increased in the past decade. And also the black market. In the black markets, most ivory items are small machine-produced items such as the bangles and pendants.
And Gao said that they are sold at low ivory price in the black market for about $2,000, which is about 10 times more than the price in Africa, which makes the ivory smuggling very lucrative. This is the black market.
As for the grey market, that the grey market is strongly correlated to the elephant poaching level in Africa. This is what I found. And I also investigated the drivers for these three type of markets. And I found that the arts investment after 2008 is the very important driver. Many Western conservationists talks about the Chinese middle class buying the ivory to show off their social status, but what I found is most Chinese believe it is not the middle class, it is the certain rich. Chinese call them 暴发户.
And Gao told me that the reason why they buy ivory is because they believe ivory is a very good long-term investment. And unfortunately, this is a driver that has led to substantial increase for the demand of ivory in China. In the second part, we are going back to the source of those three markets that Yufeng described, which is elephant poaching. One elephant is killed every 15 minutes in Africa for ivory.
The source of the ivory in China, in the legal part, so for the white market, Chinese government has some stockpile of ivory, legal ivory, which is
what do you mean by
legal ivory? I mean, they got this ivory before the CITES ban, before the international ivory trade was banned.
What Gao means here is that this ivory comes from old sources, a kind of stockpile. In 1981, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, secured an agreement among its members to ban the international trade in ivory. The goal was to stop the decline of African elephant populations. However, an analysis of elephant populations data from 1979 to 2007 found that some of the 37 countries in Africa with elephants continued to lose substantial numbers of them, which seems to be explained by the presence of unregulated domestic ivory markets in and near countries with declines in elephant populations.
This issue is very complex because some countries would like to legalize the ivory trade. For example, in some Southern African countries, they would like to sell ivory to China and even Japan so that they can use the money they earn from this ivory trade to support the local community to do conservation in their country, because they already have a large population of elephants in their country, for example in Botswana. And I just mentioned China import 62 tons of ivory from 4,000 African countries. So this is also a source of legal ivory supply for China's white market. Yeah, but for the black market, yes, indeed. Now China, more and more Chinese are going to Africa, and they are doing business in Africa. They are doing traveling in Africa, and ivory smuggling, where it is large scale or small scale, is happening. I would suggest it is very important to work with the law enforcement units, and it's very important to improve or upgrade the efforts for law enforcement in this issue. China has a very strict law about environmental conservation, but usually the implementation of law is not so good. So I would suggest it's very important to strengthen the law enforcement effort. But whether I'm going to work with this law enforcement, I'm not sure at this moment. At least very clear my career.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. At the end of this interview, I asked Gao how does he position himself as a Chinese studying in the US, investigating the Chinese ivory trade. How does he see his future if he has to go back to China and work in China?
That's a tricky question. So I tried to, by doing this research, because as a Chinese studying in the US, I have a very vantage point that allows to me to see all these different culture outlooks, different perspectives in different countries. So by doing this research, I try to bring people together, try to understand what is really going on, and how can we bring all these different perspectives, different people with different understanding about a problem together and work together to solve this problem. This is the purpose, or this is my goal of doing this research. So as you just mentioned, it's very difficult to position myself. I try to be as independent as possible during the research. So I don't accept money from any government or any NGO. I got my grant from Yale University, an academic institution, and I try to be independent and try to listen to both sides and try to understand their concerns, their insight, and to see why they think in this way and why the other think in that way, and how can I bring these different perspectives together to have them achieve a more comprehensive understanding about this issue and to find a common ground where we can work together to solve this problem.
If you want to know more about Yufeng's research, you might just Google his name, Yufeng Gao. You will find out that he has won already many prizes. He has also been interviewed by the National Geographic, and for this conference, he won the first prize of the best talk. He also had to leave earlier. At the end of this conference, he was invited to give a CITES workshop in Hangzhou, China. So congratulations, Yufeng. Keep going. The elephants and the people need you. And now, let's hear the voice of another conservationist.
My name is Sean Maxwell. I'm studying conservation decision making here at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. I'm in the first year of my PhD. At the moment, we're looking at extreme weather events and their impact on species. I've had a chance to present some of that work here. It's been a great opportunity. Our research suggests that we just reviewed the impact of extreme weather events on different species. We looked through literature back to 1935 and found 500 or over 500 documented impacts of extreme weather events on different species. The extreme weather events we considered were floods, droughts, cyclones or hurricanes and typhoons, heat waves and cold waves. So some impacts were good on species. There are cases of deer having increased food availability following a hurricane. There were a few neutral impacts where there was no response from communities after an extreme weather event, but the overwhelming majority of impacts were negative, some of which were quite concerning. There were instances, 16 reported instances of populations going locally extinct following an extreme weather event. Also, different cases of many cases of species just showing big declines in their population size. Other interesting ones where there's declines in fecundity or declines or increased susceptibility to disease. So there's a case of lions in the Serengeti being able to tolerate a series of diseases in isolation, but when a drought came through, there was led to co-infection and a lot of mortality. So there's these sort of interesting impacts that we decided to summarise and categorise and try to publish. Interestingly as well, we plotted where the documented cases were around the planet and found that there are some regions like the USA, Europe and Australia where the amount of studies as sort of matches the amount of extreme weather events, which is a good thing. But there's other regions, particularly Western Africa, Central Africa, where there's been a lot of floods and drought and and also Eastern Asia, Western Asia, Southern Asia, where there's been a lot of cyclone events and floods, and there's little to no studies carried out on how species are responding to these events. So there's a bit of a gap there, and of course these regions, particularly Southeast Asia, Western Asia, is expected to receive more flooding and drought events in the future. So it's a bit of a concern there. We want to draw that to the attention to the public and hopefully have extreme weather events more formally included in vulnerability assessments in the future. That's the goal.
Great, thank you for this. And so we are on the third day of the conference now. What do you think of the conference so far?
It's been fantastic. It's been great to meet all the other people. I was here 2 years ago for the student conference, and it's great to see some friends I met there, but also see the conference develop, and I think the quality of the research is really increasing, and it's fascinating to hear what everyone's having to say from all around the world, and it's also leading to a few opportunities to collaborate with different students from different nations, and there's a lot of common interest, but also different ideas. So it's great to be a part of the conference.
My name is Natasha Peters. I'm working for the Bulgarian Society for the Protection of Birds, which is BirdLife Bulgaria. I started working on this project, which kind of was independent, just kind of became a research project for me. So the overview of the project, which I'm presenting here at SCCS, I'm doing a poster, is basically to find out the cause of decline and the threats for the Egyptian vulture within Bulgaria and Greece. Basically, why are they disappearing? Why aren't they returning? And addressing those threats. So what we've done so far is satellite tag 22 juveniles. Well, 20 juveniles, one adult and one subadult. And we found that the juveniles have a high mortality in their first migration. This is because there's too few adults to lead them on their migration through the land, through Turkey down to Africa. So what they're doing is trying to go over the Mediterranean on their own and dying at sea. So that's one of the reasons, because there's too few adults to lead them. And another reason is they have a high indirect poisoning in Greece. Farmers will put out poison baits to try to kill foxes, feral dogs, and wolves, and vultures will ingest these and be poisoned. And the third main cause of mortality that we found is in Africa. There's a high persecution there, again, poisoning, electrocution, or direct persecution through hunting. So we really need to focus our conservation efforts now within Africa, because within Bulgaria, they've pretty much been addressed. So it's just poisoning in Greece and conservation efforts within Africa. So that's kind of the focus now, moving forward.
You have been listening to the PrimateCast, a podcast series dedicated to the study and conservation of primates around the world. Brought to you by the Centre for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology of the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University. Visit us online at www.cicaspp.pri.kyoto-u.ac.jp/news/podcasts and follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/theprimatecast and on Twitter at theprimatecast.